Hello! In this video we're going to have a look at how to activate any of Xdebug's features. Previously we've looked at what Xdebug's modes are, as well as to diagnose when something goes wrong. But in this video I want to look in depth on how to activate Xdebug's features. I will be running PHP's built-in web server on the command line, and then in the browser we'll have a look at what all of the effects are. Xdebug has a few different settings, which have different values. An important one is the Xdebug.start with request configuration setting, which default is set to default. Which means that if we start Xdebug only without any configuration settings, it will only have the develop mode enabled. So let me run this and then request this in the browser. And you can see that the only feature that's enabled is the development helpers. Now, the development helpers are always there. They don't depend on any of the starting with request settings. The ones that do are the step debugger, the profiler, as well as the tracer, or as the screen calls it here, tracing. The two settings that we're looking at today is Xdebug mode and Xdebug start with request. We'll look at Xdebug's three main features in turn. The first thing we're looking at is the profiler. Xdebug's profiler can only start when the PHP request starts. It cannot be started during the request. The default for start with request is to immediately start always. Let me demonstrate that. I'm modifying my line to turn on the profiler. When I now reload my test script, you'll see that the profiler gets enabled, as well that a profiling file has been created. In some cases, you might not always want your profiler to start, even though you have enabled Xdebug's profiler. You can configure that by setting Xdebug.start with request to trigger. Let's now do that. When we now reload the page, you'll see that the profiler didn't kick in. If Xdebug start with request is set to trigger, you need to use a trigger to activate the feature. There are two ways to do that, depending on whether you run this on the command line or in the browser. Let's have a look at the command line first. To enable a trigger on the command line, you need to export an environment variable. For the profiler, that is Xdebug_profile. And now we start the built-in web server again and reload our page. And you can now see that a profiling file has been generated. I've gone back to not setting the trigger on the command line. An alternative way is to use a browser extension. I have installed in Firefox Xdebug helper, but there's also one available for Chrome. I'll provide links in the description. The browser extension allows you to select which feature you want to have enabled. In this case we want profile, so we'll select that. When we now reload the page, the profiler should kick in again. And here we have it. The browser extension will set a cookie. In this case it will set the Xdebug_profile cookie with the same name as that we had on the command line. Now let's have a look at Xdebug's tracing functionality. When we reload the page with trace mode enabled, you see that tracing is now selected here, but the function tracing is not active. Function tracing will only happen by default if there is a trigger present. The most common way of doing this is again to use the browser extension and change it to trace. When now requesting the page, a trace file is being generated. Similarly, it is possible to do this on the command line as well. In this case, we have to export the Xdebug_trace environment variable. We restart the web server and reload the page. And a trace file is being created again. It is also possible to always have the trace functionality kick in. First we'll have to unset the environment variable, and then we can restart the web server and having Xdebug.start _with request set to yes. When we reload the page, you'll see that the function trace will be generated again. It is also possible to either not start off the request and also not be able to reply to a trigger. For that you can set Xdebug start with request to no. When we now reload the page, the function tracing will not activate, not even if we turn on the trigger with the browser extension. It is however still possible to start the tracer by calling Xdebug_start_trace manually. The third feature we're going to have a look at is Xdebug's step debugger. which works in a similar way as the tracer, which means by default it would not create a debugging session, but only if a trigger is present. But first let's configure Xdebug to always initiate a debugging session even if a trigger is not present. Let me update our command line. We switch the mode to debug, and then we set start with request to yes. That means that Xdebug will always try to initiate a debugging session, no matter whether a trigger is present or not. At the moment I don't have a debugging client attached, so we won't be able to see it popping up in our IDE, but the Xdebug diagnostic log will still show you that Xdebug attempted to connect to the IDE. Let me reload this page. First of all, we can now see that our step debugger is enabled, and below it says, with the red dot saying could not connect to debugging client, tried localhost 9003, which is our default. Which makes sense because we don't have a client attached to it. Just to show you that I'm not making this up, I will now use dbgp client to show that a debug connection is being initiated. After having started the client, it says it's waiting for an income connection on port 9003, which is the default. I will now reload the page in my browser. And you can see that it freezes. That is of course because the request popped up in my debugging client. I will now just continue running the script because there's nothing much to debug. The client says stopping OK, which makes sense because there's really only one line in my script. In the output of Xdebug info, we can however see that the debugging session activated. It showed you that the debugger was active, what the connected client was, and some internal dbgp settings, which can be useful for debugging things with IDEs. I will now leave the debug client behind and show you the different ways of triggering. If we do not set start with request to yes, the default value of it default means that the debugger only activates when a trigger is present. When I run PHP's built-in web server and request the page, the debugger should not attempt to kick in now. And it indeed does not. For both the command line as well as in a web browser environment, it is possible to activate the debugger. On the command line, we do this again with an environment variable. The environment variable or cookie to use is Xdebug_session. I'll restart the web server and reload the page again. And you'll see that Xdebug now tried to initiate a debugging connection. I'll now remove the environment variable and do the same thing with the browser extension. In the top right here, I will now switch from trace to debug and reload the page again. And again, you'll get the same output. Which means that there are two ways to get Xdebug step debugger to activate. One is by setting Xdebug start_request to yes, in which case Xdebug will always try to initiate a debugging request. Or with having Xdebug start with request to either the default value or set to trigger, the debugger activates by making this trigger either on the command line with an environment variable or by setting a cookie through the browser extension. On the command line, it is also possible to use a generic environment variable, which is called Xdebug_trigger. No matter which feature is enabled, the feature will then activate based on this trigger. In order to demonstrate that, we're going to start a debugging session, make a profiling file and trace file all at the same time. For that to work, I will set Xdebug start with request to trigger. That will override the default, which is specifically important for the profiler because otherwise it would start even without a trigger being present. Then we configure the three modes that we need and get the web server going. When we reload our page now, we'll see that the profiler, step debugger and tracer are enabled, but that neither the step debugger is active, the profiler or function tracing. This changes if we set the generic Xdebug_trigger to a value. Let's see what happens if we reload the page again. We see that Xdebug tried starting a debugging connection, but because nothing is listening, that didn't actually end up happening. We also have a profile file and a trace file. Enabling all three modes at the same time isn't a very useful one, but at least it is possible. Let me go back to the debugger and having Xdebug start with request set to its default as well. Which, as we now know, means only activate if a trigger is present. So far we have triggered the debugger by setting Xdebug_session to 1. Xdebug in most cases does not care which value it is, but unfortunately some IDEs do. If we look at the configuration for the Xdebug helper browser plugin, it shows you that you can set the IDE key to something specific. NetBeans, for example, requires the IDE key to be set to NetBeans-Xdebug, which means that instead of using an arbitrary value on a command line, you need to set Xdebug_session to NetBeans-Xdebug. There's also a specific one for Eclipse, for Mac GDBP, and for PHP Storm, although PHP Storm doesn't really mind much. The requirement by IDEs to set a specific session key are unnecessary and a bad implementation on the IDE side. This unfortunately makes it more difficult than it should be. As I said, for PHP Storm it doesn't matter very much. In some cases you want to make sure that not everybody can start a debugging request with a browser extension. For example, if your debugging runs on a production or publicly accessible servers. Something that I don't advocate to do. However, it is possible to configure Xdebug in such a way that it will only initiate a debugging session when only a specific value is present. I will show you how that works. First of all, we set the IDE key that we required to secret key and click Save. We need to select the same key in the Xdebug configuration. We do that with the setting trigger value. Now that we have set a shared secret, we can start the debugger again with the browser extension. And reload the page. Because the trigger value that we have configured matches the trigger value that the browser extension uses, the debug session gets initiated. Let me now configure it in such a way that the values don't match. We've made a change in the browser extension. When we then reload the page, we'll see that the debugging session doesn't start because the trigger values don't match. With this we have come to the end of this video. I hope you have learned how to enable all of Xdebug's features, but more importantly, how to activate them. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I'll be back in the future. Goodbye.